Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. This week we're going to be looking at Studio Ghibli and their ascension to the top of the domestic box office. We're also going to be looking at a couple of things from last week's show, which was packed with stuff that I'd missed while I was away. I have a couple of corrections. We're going to be looking at a bunch of stuff this week, as we always do. If you saw my Golden Globes video that came out yesterday, I mentioned on that video that I am at the tail end of a cold, so my voice sounds okay now, but it might get a little weaker as we go on. So apologies. I'm going to try to keep chugging honey and water and tea and whatever else in between little segments here on the show while I'm taping. But thanks for your patience in advance. But let's forget about all of that stuff and look at the weekend box office. And the number one movie was The Boy and the Heron, which is the latest film from Studio Ghibli and Hayao Miyazaki at just under $13 million. It's ahead of where a lot of people had seen it. This is the first time that Studio Ghibli has been at the top of the domestic box office, and really impressive when you think about it. Yes, it is a weaker weekend, and it's been a weaker season at the box office than usual, but I think it is pretty great to see Studio Ghibli up there, and we'll look historically at how it's done in the US box office-wise in just a few minutes. In second place was The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. It's been entrenched there for a few weeks now. In its fourth week of release, it dropped just 34.4% for a $9.29 million total. Its domestic total now above $135 million, so it's had good legs, as we say here on the show and in the box office arena. In third place, staying in third place, is Godzilla Minus One, a great hold from week 1 to week 2, just 24.8% off from its debut weekend. A total around $8.5 million. Its domestic total is now at $25.5 million. This was a movie that I really enjoyed. You can see my review for it right here on the channel. And a lot of people have been talking about the budget for that movie because it was reported somewhere that it had a $15 million budget. The director of the movie has actually intimated that it might have even been a little bit less than that. And a lot of people have said, like, well, see, this is how you do it. Why is Hollywood pumping so much money into these movies when you can make a movie that looks as great as a Godzilla Minus One for $15 million? And I will say, first of all, that I agree with the part about wasteful Hollywood spending. It's a point that I made on the show many other times. But the spending that is done across different film industries is not the same from country to country. For example, there have been a lot of stories about animators and visual effects artists in Japan, not just this year, but in recent years, and the fact that they are chronically underpaid. They are pumping out content and shows and movies that people watch all the time, but they're not paid a lot. Now, it's possible that the visual effects artists on this film were perhaps compensated more than many of the other artists that we've read about in the press, but I think it's also possible that that's not necessarily the case. Visual effects have been undervalued here in the United States. Reports are that they're even more undervalued and underpaid in Japan and in many other countries. I'm not singling Japan out specifically here. So while it is encouraging that a movie like Godzilla Minus One that was made for a lower budget point is as good as it is and is performing as well as it's performing, I would be careful when you're comparing movies and budgets, etc., to do a one-to-one analysis between the American film industry and the film industry in any other country, because the valuation of workers and where the money goes isn't exactly the same everywhere that you go. In fourth place is Trolls Band Together, dropping just 22.2% from last weekend, a total just over $6 million. It's now at $82.9 million. If it can hang around for these next few weeks during the holidays, it should get over $100 million. We'll see. Renaissance, a film by Beyonce, took a big drop, 74.9% in its second weekend for a domestic total of just over $5.4 million. Its total is now at $28.5 million domestically. This is a bigger drop than we saw for the Eras Tour, and Beyonce also didn't play during the week. It was taking off days, I think Monday through Wednesday or Monday through Thursday, so it does seem like this was more of an opening weekend pop than this prolonged box office event that we've seen for the Eras Tour. Not that this is anything to turn your nose up at, especially because these event films, these concert movies, are not really that expensive to produce, but it doesn't look like they're going to be able to replicate the success of the Eras Tour with Renaissance. Falling out of the top 5 in its third week is Wish from Disney, dropping 31.2% in week number 3 for a total of just over $5.3 million. Its domestic total now hovering just under $50 million. Napoleon is in 7th place in its third week. It dropped 43.4% at a total of just over $4.1 million. Its domestic total now just over $50 million. Waitress the Musical, which is a special limited night engagement from Fathom Events, was able to bring in $2.56 million over the weekend. Its domestic total is now at $3.2 million. And I've said this before, I really support this new interest that so many theater chains and distributors are showing in doing things like putting a Broadway musical in theaters around the country, even just for 2 or 3 nights, because number one, it enhances the availability for these musicals. For people that could never see the show on Broadway, you can now go see it in the theater. It's not quite the same seeing it on a movie screen versus on the stage, but you still get to see the show, and it's a way to diversify revenue streams to bring people in the doors. So I'm hoping we see more things like Waitress the Musical and Renaissance and the Eras Tour and things like that. It's something that Hamilton and Disney tried to kickstart back in 2020. I don't know how it would have done theatrically if it had been put out, but I think it would have been a pretty big hit. Instead, it ended up going, of course, to Disney Plus due to the pandemic. In 9th place is Animal, which dropped 61.9% from its impressive debut last week for a $2.48 million total. Its domestic total is now at $11.7 million. And in 10th place is The Shift. This is the latest film from Angel Studios, not able to replicate, much as Beyonce wasn't able to replicate what Taylor Swift did, The Shift is not able to replicate what Sound of Freedom did. It's at $8.4 million after 2 weeks in theaters. Dropping out of the top 10 this weekend are 2 movies, Thanksgiving, which was there for 3 weeks, and then John Woo's Silent Night, which was in the top 10 for just 1 week. Disappointing box office returns on that film. And looking at the movies that lost the most theaters this past weekend, Saltburn led the pack with 859 theaters lost. It's now remaining in 707 theaters. This is the kind of movie that in the old system or under the old system would have been expanding its theater count at this point, because it just got some Golden Globe nominations for the performances in the film as award season ramps up. But MGM and Amazon want to put that on Prime and get it streaming soon. So it is now pulling Saltburn out of theaters so it can get it on Prime in time for the holidays, just part of the new distribution model. The Marvels dropped another 500 theaters. Its theater count is now under 2,000 just a month into its release cycle. It's in 1,700 theaters. Wish dropped 490 screens. It's now in 3,410 theaters, and I imagine we may see some more screens drop next weekend, although it might stick around for the Christmas holidays because there is still that family market. Thanksgiving dropped 481 theaters. It's actually in wider release right now than the Marvels. It's still in over 2,000 theaters. And Five Nights at Freddy's dropped 467 theaters. It's now in only 265 theaters nationwide, and of course, streaming on Peacock. Closing this week, we were just talking about it, is Taylor Swift the Eras Tour. After 8 weeks, there were no grosses reported for it this past weekend, which is what I consider to be closed. And when we look at the snapshot here, a $178.9 million domestic gross, a $70 million international gross, a worldwide gross just under $250 million. Now, the earnings and the distribution is completely different for this movie than pretty much any other movie for a couple of reasons. Number one, Taylor Swift herself and her team get a direct cut of the revenue, and also because AMC was the distributor and also basically the quote-unquote studio behind this movie. So it's a little bit more difficult for me to try to calculate a rough idea of how profitable the Eras Tour was. But I found a few sources saying that Taylor Swift got around 60% of the revenue from the film, and assuming that she gets 60% of the gross revenue, which is basically 60% of the revenue before you take anything out, before you deduct expenses or anything like that. And Taylor Swift seems like the kind of talent that would be able to get gross revenue, then her share of the earnings for the Eras Tour would be around $140 million. At least that's what would be going back to her and her team. Even if it's not gross revenue or there's less revenue than that, they don't get 58% as has been reported. I think around $100 million is probably going back to Team Taylor Swift. And when you talk about AMC, even if you deduct $140 million that goes back to Taylor Swift and her team, that leaves them with a pool of around $100 million or so. Of course, you do have to cut in some other distributors, and you have to pay those $15 million production costs and all of the marketing that you did pay for. But when you count in things like concessions and stuff like that, plus their share of the revenue, I think that AMC probably easily was able to bring in $100 million plus of all different kinds of revenue, including popcorn and snacks and all of that stuff. So I think that this was really a win all around for Taylor Swift, a win for AMC. Of course, they're facing big debt. This didn't solve all of their debt problems with just one project, but this is the kind of thing that was marketed smartly in that you found a star who didn't really have to market it much at all. It was kept at a low budget and it performed exceptionally well. So really no notes on the Eras Tour. I think it did everything that it meant to do and more, and because it was good for the theatrical business, I hope that there are other people who can figure out how to replicate it. Let's take a look at what I like to call the road to recovery. So what you see here are 3 lines. The blue line are the weekend averages from 2015 through 2019, so the 5 years preceding the pandemic. The red line would be the weekend averages for 2021 and 2022, and the dotted black line are the weekend box office totals from this year. And as you can see, we started out fairly well, consistently above where we've been the past couple of years and often dipping above the averages from pre-pandemic times. But the late summer and the fall have not been great. Basically everything post-Barbenheimer, and you can see that we're basically performing or hovering around where we've been post-pandemic as theaters have reopened, oftentimes performing below that number, that red line. You can see this past weekend, we were just above what the average has been for 2021 and 2022, although still well below where we were pre-pandemic. We'll see these last 3 weeks of the year, how we're able to perform. But this is basically the tale of two halves this year. After the start of the summer, and basically when the actors and writers strikes started, the theatrical business just took a nosedive, often worse off than we were as they were trying to recover from the pandemic. And so now we have to look into 2024 and see what that recovery looks like. It's just been a really bad year, a really difficult year, a year of highs and lows, as you can see from this chart, for the theatrical business, and it's going to continue into 2024. You can also see what's hurting the theatrical business right now is the lack of a continually performing Disney film. For 2021 and 2022, the highest grossing film was the continued box office performance of Encanto, which was very dramatically hamstrung by the fact that the theatrical business was still getting back on its feet. And you can see that for the years 2015 through 2019, the highest performing film was Frozen 2, which was 2 or 3 weeks into its Thanksgiving run. So having Wish in the marketplace but not performing well is also keeping the overall theatrical average down. We'll see how we do in the next few weeks. We do have several more movies that have yet to come out. We'll see if we can get that line back above the red and the blue to end the year on a high note. This is the fall holiday box office chart, and Taylor Swift The Eras Tour right now is at number 1. There are very few films that could really dethrone it. Perhaps Wonka, if it does really, really well over the holiday season. Aquaman would be a movie that you would think would do it, but the tracking on the film is not looking strong. The Color Purple, I guess, could always catch fire and take over that number 1 spot, but I'd say those are all pretty much long shots. I think Wonka would have the best shot, so we may well end the fall holiday box office season this last third of the year with The Eras Tour as the number 1 movie. Five Nights at Freddy's is at number 2 right now, but The Hunger Games is very close behind. It will take over that number 2 spot in the next couple days, actually. The Nun 2 hanging out there at number 4. Trolls Band Together at $82.9 million actually takes over the number 5 spot. It has outgrossed The Marvels, which drops down to number 6. We covered really in excruciating detail just how bad this movie is for Disney last week. Killers of the Flower Moon is at 7, The Exorcist Believers at 8, Paw Patrol The Mighty Movies at 9, and Saw X is at 10. Those last 3 movies have all ended their box office runs. Let's take a look outside the domestic marketplace right now to the international world. So this is all markets that are not the US and Canada. And the number 1 film internationally is Wonka, which opened in many markets this past weekend and brought in $43.2 million. Honestly, that's a promising start for the film. We'll see how it does here domestically this upcoming weekend. In second place was Napoleon at $16.1 million as it continues to play around the world. And, you know, sometimes these weird coincidences happen. When you look at Wonka and Napoleon next to each other, it looks like one of those memes, how it started and how it's going. You can never really plan stuff like that, but it gives me a chuckle as I'm sitting hunched over a keyboard prepping the show every week. In third place is Animal at $16 million, followed by 12/12 The Day, which is a South Korean film about a real coup that happened there in 1960. 1979. In fifth place internationally is a film from China called The Invisible Guest, which is a Chinese remake of a Spanish film about a mysterious murder. When you take those international grosses and you combine them with our domestic weekend grosses, we get the top 5 films around the world for this past weekend. And even though it was not playing domestically, Wonka was able to bring in enough from international markets to be the highest grossing film worldwide at $43.2 million. It may well repeat that feat next week when you add in its domestic opening here. The Hunger Games comes in second place, dropping just 30.2% worldwide from last weekend, only about $80,000 ahead of Napoleon. That's statistically almost a tie between those movies for second place and third place. That's a rounding error, which people tell me, by the way, I make on this show all the time. Animal comes in fourth place, dropping 56.4% worldwide from its debut last weekend at $18.5 million. See, I think that might be one of them right there. And Wish comes in fifth place, dropping 34.3% at $17.4 million. So before we talk about this weekend's box office, I wanted to loop back and clean up a couple of things from last week's show. One of them is kind of a clarification, one of them is an addition. The one thing I wanted to clarify was a graphic that I showed last week that was talking about the losses that Disney had incurred in the theatrical window with their theatrical profits or lack thereof for the year so far. And I said that Disney had lost about $1.37 billion this year in theatrical revenues, not counting merchandising and some of the ancillary markets. And this was a graphic that I showed just to kind of put it in perspective, showing my estimated profits for 3 big hits in the sort of Disney family and how their estimated losses this year had pretty much wiped out the profits from that. I included their Spider-Man No Way Home, and what I should have done is mentioned that, yes, Disney does not get the full profits from Spider-Man No Way Home, and I didn't mean to imply that Spider-Man's profits went directly to Disney. The point of it was really to pick 3 hugely successful movies and show just how much Disney had lost by saying that it wiped out the theatrical profits from all of those movies. But when I did that, I neglected to note that not all of No Way Home's profits went to Disney. It wasn't really supposed to be Disney specific. It was more about just the scale of the damage that was done and how much profit was wiped out, regardless of which studio it went to. So that's something I should have clarified last week. And then something I got a lot of feedback on was the fact that I covered the Marvels so extensively last week and didn't mention the history that Nia DaCosta made as a black woman sitting in the director's chair. And that is something that actually crossed my mind as I was prepping last week's show, but it was such a down show on the Marvels and talking about just what a catastrophically huge box office failure it was. It almost felt like it would be adding insult to injury, or it would be disingenuous in some way to be like, but hey, look, this was a really good job, just in the context of what I was talking about. But let's loop back to the Marvels, and I should mention that Nia DaCosta did set the record for the highest opening from a black female director in domestic movie history and also worldwide box office history. So the Marvel's $46.1 million opening was not great for Marvel, but it was good for Nia DaCosta, and the fact that she now sets the mark for a black female director as far as the debut weekend. She unseats A Wrinkle in Time's Ava DuVernay at $33.1 million. That's now second place. Although Nia DaCosta had already made some box office history, she also has the third highest opening weekend for a black female director with 2021's Candyman. That movie also marked the first time that a black woman directed a film that opened number 1 at the domestic box office. So Nia DaCosta now has both of those records. In fourth place on this list was The Woman King back in 2022 from Gina Prince Bythewood at $19 million, and then Little from Tina Gordon back in 2019 at $15.4 million. And I think that these are all commendable achievements. But the thing that I really take away from this is that we do still need to be expanding the number of people and the type of people that we put in the director's chair. We need to make sure that we are bringing all different viewpoints, not just to small indie films or films that do well in the awards circuit, but also bringing those viewpoints and those perspectives to larger blockbuster movies. I like that we've made so much progress progress on this chart just in the last few years. And hopefully in 5 years, we will look at even more progress because, the Marvels, I was not a fan of the movie. I trashed it pretty much here on the channel. But I do regret the fact that some people are going to take away as a quote-unquote lesson from the performance of the Marvels that you shouldn't pull out the director chair for a director like Nia DaCosta, who I think makes really interesting movies. I think that she kind of got chewed up by the Marvel process, as did everybody else with this film. And so I really just hope that things kind of don't go back to the status quo that they were several years ago, that there are lessons learned at a corporate level that don't necessarily attach themselves to the directors or the stars of these movies, and that eventually the studios will be able to make sure that they are producing content, movies, television. I know I hate that content word, but it's the shorthand now. But basically that they're producing things at a high enough level that you can put a talented director in that director's chair and you can put people in front of the camera, and it is solid enough from a creative standpoint and from a standpoint of being thought through enough on the executive level from the top down that you don't necessarily have to hedge your bets on movies like the Marvels. We've got so much more to cover here today, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsors for this week's show. Today's episode is brought to you by Factor. It's the holidays, and odds are that you're running around trying to finish work, shop for loved ones, and get everything you need to do crossed off your list. Well, with Factor, you can get nutritious, flavorful meals to help you eat well for breakfast, lunch, and dinner delivered right to your door, so you don't have to worry about it. You can skip the meal planning, grocery shopping, prepping, and cleaning up with Factor's fresh, never frozen meals, and you won't have to clear much time in your schedule because Factor meals are ready in just 2 minutes. So all you have to do is heat and enjoy. Each week, you can choose from over 35 chef-crafted meals that support a healthy lifestyle and meet your meal preferences. And Factor isn't just for dinner. They also offer over 55 add-ons, from quick breakfast items, lunch to go, grab-and-go snacks, and ready-to-drink cold-pressed juices, shakes, and smoothies. This December, get Factor and enjoy eating well without the hassle. Simply choose what you want and enjoy fresh, flavor-packed meals delivered right to your door, ready in just 2 minutes, no prep, no mess. Head to factormeals.com/Murrell50 and use code Murrell50 to get 50% off. That's code Murrell50 at factormeals.com/Murrell50 to get 50% off. This episode's brought to you by Mint Mobile. The holiday season is all about giving to others, but it's okay to give something to yourself every once in a while. And with Mint Mobile's best wireless deal of the year, you can give yourself the gift of insane savings this holiday season. Right now, when you switch to Mint Mobile and buy any 3-month plan, you'll get another 3 months for free. That's 6 months of premium wireless service for the price of 3. And you don't have to get out in that holiday traffic because Mint Mobile lets you order and activate everything from home. So let's say you're paying $60 a month for your mobile plan. You can take that $360 you pay for 6 months of service, and by switching to Mint, you can turn that into $90, which with 3 months free becomes $45 for 6 months of wireless service. An extra $300 in your pocket would feel pretty good, right? All Mint Mobile plans come with unlimited talk and text, plus high-speed data delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. And you can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan, or if you need a new device for a limited time, you can get 6 months of free service when you buy a select device and plan. For a limited time, buy any 3-month Mint Mobile plan and get 3 more months free by going to mintmobile.com/Murrell. That's mintmobile.com/Murrell. New customers only. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. So let's turn now to The Boy and the Heron and Studio Ghibli, and the fact that this set a few different marks as far as the box office for this year and beyond. Let's look first at the top openings for international films at the domestic box office this year. And The Boy and the Heron actually had the highest opening for any film that was not produced in the United States so far at $12.8 million. It actually supplants Godzilla -1, which took over that spot just last weekend at $11.4 million. Then we have Demon Slayer to the Swordsmith Village. It's not a movie, but it is from Japan. It was a theatrical exhibition, so I'm putting it on the list at $10.11 million. And then 2 films from India, Patan and Animal. We've talked so much about about the Indian films this year and the fact that they have been able to break through, especially in the limited release market. But Japan is also having a great year at the domestic box office. And actually, when we look at the top opening films internationally this decade from 2020 onward, they are all from Japan. The top opening film is Demon Slayer, the movie Mugen Train, which opened at $22.7 million just a couple of years ago. Then we had Dragon Ball Superhero at $21.1 million. Jujutsu Kaisen 0 in third place at $18 million. So 3 anime series adaptations or spin-offs or prequels. Then we have The Boy and the Heron at number 4 from Studio Ghibli, and Godzilla Minus One, the only live action film there, at number 5 at $11.4 million. So Japan doing really well in the last few years as far as increasing their market share here in the United States. I think that anime is building an even bigger audience. Crunchyroll is helping. Of course, the expansion of TikTok and social media and people getting exposed to these shows more and more and more. And, I'm becoming a fan of a lot of them. So I like that we are seeing an increasing share of box office for animation from Japan and for movies from all over the world. It looks like we are finally kind of becoming a little bit more of a global culture when things like RRR can break through, or Demon Slayer, or The Boy and the Heron. And I think that that's great because that ultimately brings people from different countries and different backgrounds together over one common thing. It's one of my favorite things that movies do. Looking at the history of Studio Ghibli's opening weekends domestically, if you don't adjust for inflation, The Boy and the Heron basically doubles the previous mark, which was The Secret World of Arrietty back in 2012 at $6.4 million, back when Disney was handling the distribution of all of Studio Ghibli's movies. Ponyo's in third place, which came out back in 2009 at $3.5 million. And then basically we have Spirited Away and Howl's Moving Castle from 2002 and 2005, when Disney treated them like specialty movies, international films, limited releases, under $500,000 debuts. The market for Studio Ghibli has grown so much in the last couple of decades, and this is really kind of the culmination of that process now, with Disney no longer distributing the films and with them now coming out at number 1 at the box office instead of successful but much more limited releases. Looking at Studio Ghibli's domestic grosses overall, The Boy and the Heron is already the third highest grossing film in history from Studio Ghibli domestically, unadjusted for inflation. The Wind Rises is at number 5 at $5.2 million, followed by Spirited Away at just over $10 million. Then we have The Boy and the Heron right now in third place, Ponyo in second place at just over $15 million, and The Secret World of Arrietty at $19.2 million. That title, by the way, The Secret World of Arrietty, was what it was released under here in the United States. And finally, we have the top 5 worldwide grosses for Studio Ghibli films. The Boy and the Heron is not yet at this level. It's just around the $100 million mark right now. Spirited Away, easily the highest grossing Studio Ghibli film worldwide at over $380 million, followed by Howl's Moving Castle at $237.8 million, then Ponyo at just over $205 million, Arrietty at number 4 at just over $151 million. That's how it's known in many countries. I think in Japan it had another name. And then Princess Mononoke at just over $150 million, rounding out the top 5. So really a banner weekend for Studio Ghibli, their most successful domestic launch ever, unadjusted for inflation. Also a wide theatrical release. G-Kids really got behind this film. They got the dub done, which was a big selling point here in the US, and we'll see how The Boy and the Heron does as far as box office grosses here domestically, and also how it does at the Oscars and at the different awards ceremonies. It looks like it will be in contention for the best animated film, and in a year where I don't think that there's one movie that is the absolute front runner. I mean, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse was well regarded, but I don't think it's unupsettable. We'll see what The Boy and the Heron does on the awards circuit this year. Let's look at the top per theater averages for this past weekend. And at number 1, with a great per theater average, was Poor Things, which was playing in 9 theaters and brought in $73,470 per theater. We'll talk more about that number in a second. Ava DuVernay's Origin, we were just talking about her, is in second place with a great per theater number, $58,532 per theater in 2 theaters. In second place is Anselm, which was also playing in 2 theaters and brought in $21,286. It's a documentary in 3D about German artist Anselm Kiefer from director Wim Wenders. In fourth place is the documentary Psalm, Cup of Salvation, which brought in $6,894 in one theater. It is the latest in a series of wine documentaries. This installment documents Armenian winemaking. The movie also sounds like a parody of the kind of film that most people think critics watch on the weekends. You know, the fourth in a series of wine documentaries following Armenian winemakers. And now most critics are just at home trying to catch up on, Lego Masters or whatever. And then in fifth place is The Boy and the Heron in 2,205 theaters, which brought in $5,883 per theater. Poor Things didn't just have a strong per theater average, it had one of the best of the year. Asteroid City holds the number one slot at just over $142,000 in 6 theaters back in June, followed by Beau is Afraid at $80,000 per theater back in April. Then we have Poor Things, the third best per theater average number this year in 9 theaters, followed by Origin, which also came out this past weekend at number 4 at $58,531 per theater. That just edges out Past Lives, which is also looking to make some noise on the awards circuit. It released to $58,000 in 4 theaters this past June. Poor Things also putting up one of the best per theater averages of the decade so far. Asteroid City at number 1 with over $140,000. Licorice Pizza back in 2021 playing in 4 theaters is in second place at $86,289 per theater. Then we have Beau is Afraid in third place. Poor Things in fourth place, playing in 9 theaters at $73,470. And this always blows my mind. Spider-Man No Way Home rounds out the top 5 at $59,995 per theater in 4,336 theaters. It's crazy that that movie was so popular and so successful that it was equaling the demand of an art house film from a name brand Wes Anderson type director in limited release, meaning a single digit number of theaters in 4,000 plus theaters around the country. I'm sure Marvel wishes they could have a little bit more of that success right now. These were the top 5 grossers for limited release films this past weekend. This is movies in 1,000 theaters or fewer. Animal repeats there at number 1 at $2.48 million in 632 theaters. Another film from India in the Telugu language, Hi Nana, is in second place in an unknown number of theaters with $739,000. Then we have Poor Things in 9 theaters at $661,230 total. Eileen is in fourth place, expanding to 526 theaters and bringing in just under $600,000 total. And then in fifth place was a re-release of the holiday film Love Actually. Not one of my favorites, but certainly a lot of other people's. It was playing in 927 theaters and brought in $283,956. And when we look at the highest grossing films in limited release this year, this is all tickets sold as of January 1st. Patan is at number 1, Javan is at number 2, and then Animal rounds out the top 3 for films from India at number 3. It jumps up 3 spots from last week. Its total is now right at around $11.7 million. Past Lives drops down to number 4. Radical drops down to number 5. Return of the Jedi's re-release drops to number 6, and then 7 through 10 remain the same. A Man Called Otto, Rocky Our Rani, The Holdovers, and Bottoms. Many of these limited release films, independent movies, are also reliant on independent theaters, which are theaters that are not part of a big chain that really need people like yourself to show up and watch movies, and also are the ones that are programming some of the stuff that may be deemed a little too risky or not a big draw for the bigger chains. And as I've been doing most of this year, I want to devote part of the show to a spotlight on one specific independent movie theater. And this is another one that I've been lucky enough to visit. Most of the ones I've talked about, I haven't been able to see in person, but this was a theater that I really fell in love with while we were on our trip to New Zealand. It's called the Roxy Theater, and it's in Wellington, New Zealand. It opened back in 2011, and it is owned by cinematic royalty, really. It's owned by the editor of the Lord of the Rings films, Jamie Selkirk, and his wife, the co-founder of What a Workshop, Tanya Roger, and a few other locals. And the theater, which was originally built in 1928, before becoming a shopping center in the 60s and then lying vacant, was completely restored by What a Workshop and other great New Zealand artisans into a beautiful Art Deco space. There are 2 screens. Both auditoriums have very comfy seats, great sound. And one of the first things I noticed that said, hey, this is a theater that you're really going to vibe with, Dan, is the fact that they still mask their movies. This is something that I talked about, I think, way back on my Screen Junkies days, and it's something that the big chains don't do anymore. As you know, movies are shot in different aspect ratios, and most movie screens have adjustable curtains or adjustable barriers that can fit the screen to the size of the aspect ratio of the movie that you're watching. Most movie theater chains don't bother to do that because it's just an extra step and they want to move movies around onto different screens and not have to worry about it. But when we sat down to watch the movie that we came to see, one of the first things that happened was that the curtains at the top of the screen and the bottom adjusted to the aspect ratio so that the movie filled up the whole screen. There was no blank screen. It's a small thing, but it's something that a theater that really cares about movies will do, and it's something that the Roxy does. They also have great food and drink. I was lucky enough to be able to sample both of them, and this week the Roxy is showing a selection of movies, including The Boy and the Heron, Wonka, Wish, Next Goal Wins, and special screenings on Sunday of From Here to Eternity and Roadhouse. What a double feature that'd be. They'll also be screening Elf, Die Hard, and Kiss Kiss Bang Bang on Christmas Eve. That's a great lineup. And in February, the Roxy will have their latest Eat the Film screening, which is a movie accompanied by a custom menu that's themed to the movie you're watching and served at specific times during the movie to match what's happening on screen. February's Eat the Film is Labyrinth, and 2 of the 3 screenings are already sold out on the website, so if you want to check that out, you should get your tickets fast. I want to give a special thanks to Phil, who is the programmer at the Roxy and who books the movies that you see there at the theater. We were just there with our tour group having lunch. I was wandering around, taking some pictures, looking at the theater. Phil came up and said hi. He watches the show. He asked if we wanted to tour the theater, and we actually came back that night to see Thanksgiving, which is a movie that we really enjoyed. We got to meet Phil's wife and get to know them a bit better and really just learn about this theater and about Phil and his passion. We talked a lot about the challenges of running an independent theater. This is a movie theater that is run by real movie lovers, and it shows. It makes me want to live closer to New Zealand so that I could go there more often, but you can find out more about the Roxy at roxycinema.co.nz, as they say there, or roxycinema.co.nz. And if you do end up catching a movie there and Eat the Film or just a regular screening, find Phil and tell him that Dan sent you. So before we wrap up, let's take a look at a weekend in box office history, and we are going to go back 20 years to December 5th through the 7th, 2003, which saw the debut of The Last Samurai starring Tom Cruise, because when you think samurai movie, you think Tom Cruise. It debuted to $24.27 million on its way to a final gross around $111 million. In second place is the film Honey, which was part of the dance movie craze of the early 2000s, and asked the question, how much is Jessica Alba's bare midriff worth? Well, it turns out it's worth about a $12.8 million opening weekend. Its final total was around $30.2 million. In third place was The Haunted Mansion. That is not a typo. That is the original Disney The Haunted Mansion film, which dropped 61% in its second weekend. That's right, Disney has made 2 films that were based on the Haunted Mansion ride, and they released neither of them at Halloween. 20 years ago, they made a Haunted Mansion movie and said, when should we release this? And a group of executives said, I know, Thanksgiving. And the executive said, that's a great idea. And it came out and didn't do great. And then it came out and didn't do great. And then 20 years later, they made another Haunted Mansion movie, and the group of executives said, when should we put this out? And they said, I know, summer. And they said, that's a great idea. And it came out and it did worse. So what? The Haunted Mansion ended up at about $75.8 million domestically, which I think is better than this year's Haunted Mansion did, even if you don't adjust for inflation. In fourth place was Elf, which dropped 63% in its 5th week of release for a running total at that time of $139.5 million. It ended up with $178.1 million domestically. It is a true holiday classic. I love that movie. Not a classic is the film that was in 5th place, Dr. Seuss's The Cat in the Hat, which dropped 71% back in week 3, largely considered to be a disaster, but look at how disasters did back in 2003. It still made over $100 million domestically, despite being a disaster. But we don't like to just leave those numbers where they are in the past. I like to hit that inflation button to see what they'd look like in today's dollars. And when we hit the inflation button on this chart, we see that The Last Samurai debuted to an adjusted total of $40.5 million and an adjusted final total of $185.79 million. Honey had an adjusted debut of $21.49 million, followed by The Haunted Mansion with a week 2 total of $15.7 million on its way to a final of $126.7 million. Then we have Elf at $13.4 million with a final domestic total approaching $300 million. And finally, The Cat in the Hat with $11.9 million and a final domestic total of about $168.9 million. And that does it for Charts with Dan this week. The big release we'll be tracking for next week's show is Wonka. You can check out my review here on the channel, which came out last week. We'll see how it does here domestically. Also, if you're in one of 4 cities, Los Angeles, New York, Toronto, or London, you can catch Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire, the latest Zack Snyder film, which will be hitting Netflix in a matter of days globally. So if you want to fight the crowds in one of those 4 cities and go see that Zack Snyder movie in theaters, this weekend is your chance. Thank you so much, as always, for watching me break down these box office numbers. Thank you to Factor and Mint Mobile, who are my sponsors for this week's show. And of course, as always, I always appreciate you giving me a chunk of your day. Stay tuned right here for more movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until then, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.